actually filmed the video that you're about to watch a few days ago, and it is a video on how I was surprised at how much nonfiction I read in 2020. I've been thinking a lot about nonfiction and my reading habits and being a person who reads quite a bit of nonfiction. I have tips to read more nonfiction. So if you're interested in reading more nonfiction in 2021, stay tuned. Hey, I'm Mo. 2020 seems to be the year that I realized that I really like nonfiction. Now, I knew that I read nonfiction, but I didn't realize how much nonfiction I read. So I think Booktube helped me figure that out because there's been a lot of talk in 2020, especially towards the end of 2020 with the 2020 wrap-ups, of how much nonfiction people are reading. Nonfiction is on a lot of people's goals for 2021, and it got me thinking to look and actually see how much nonfiction I read out of the books that I read in 2020. So in 2020, I read 59 books, which is quite a few books for me, and I wrote down all the ones that were nonfiction. And it turns out that I read 20 nonfiction books in 2020. So that was 33.9% of the overall books that I read. So almost a perfect third of books. Now, in contrast to that, my favorite genre and probably my most read genre is mystery, mystery thriller, cozy mystery, kind of all those together. And I decided to check to see how many mysteries I read because it felt like I read far more mysteries than anything else this year. And if you go by only the true mysteries, not the books that were maybe literary fiction but had a mystery in it, but that were true mystery books, I read 20 out of 59, so 33.9%, exactly the same amount that I read of nonfiction, which means that I have a little less than 33% of all other books that I read in 2020. I think that is super interesting, and if I was a person who knew how to make graphs and charts, I would definitely make that a graph and chart because it would be really cool. If you count all the books that had a mystery in them, I actually read 25 out of 59 books that had a mystery in it, which is 42.37%. So that is much more what I was thinking, like almost half. Martin. And I read a lot of varied nonfiction. Some of them I've talked about a ton, and some of them I haven't talked about too much. So we've already talked a lot about some nonfiction that I didn't really like Eating Wildly and Basquiat. I also didn't like Little House in the Suburbs, which I thought was just too cute, but had a lot of really good information in it. Along the same lines of nonfiction about gardening and sustainability, I read I Garden Urban Style and Herbs, which were both informational, instructional books on gardening. I am going to pass on I Garden, even though I enjoyed this book. Someone else could use it more than I could, but I can't wait to use Herbs when I am planting my garden in just a few months. I'm already definitely looking for seeds, and I'm already definitely thinking of ideas to make my herb garden bigger and better and more useful in 2021, and partly that is because of this book. I also read some books about the history of ghosts and the history of cemeteries. I read this book on Greenwood Cemetery, which was one of my all-time favorite places when I lived in Brooklyn, and probably is one of my all-time favorite places in the whole world. And I also read this book on the ghosts of Cape May, which contains true ghost stories that people have heard and seen around Cape May. I read 2 books about Douglas Adams, my favorite authors. Last Chance to See is Douglas Adams and Mark Carradine, and they are traveling around finding some of the most endangered and unprotected species that are dwindling down. This book was written in the 80s, and it is amazing to see that some of these species have rebounded and come back, and some of these species are now almost extinct or practically extinct. I had read this one before. This was a reread for me. Actually, these were both rereads for me. I also reread Don't Panic, which is basically the story of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and how Douglas Adams created those books and the subsequent movies, TV shows, video games, radio scripts, all sorts of stuff that went with it. Always a good read, and one of Neil Gaiman's first books. I read some books on travel. I read some case studies of medical anomalies. I read Michael Pollan's Food Rules, which I'd heard a lot about. He is famous for The Omnivore's Dilemma, but this is kind of a condensed version. This book is super outdated, and I definitely do not recommend reading it, but it was very quick. These are like little blurbs, rules, ideas for eating. Some of them have historical references or cultural references, and some of them just come from his imagination and his findings as a writer. It wasn't very good. I read a few sort of biographies. This was a biography of Beatrix Potter, The Tale of Beatrix Potter by Margaret Lane, which was awesome. And I read this glimpse into Picasso's life and how much he loved his dachshund Lump. So those were some of the 20 nonfiction books that I read in 2020, and I'm really excited to see which nonfiction books I read in 2021. There's always all sorts of different nonfiction writing out there, and there's always some nonfiction that you will enjoy. Some of the books that I didn't have that I think were worth mentioning were Magical Herbalism by Scott Cunningham. A travel book I didn't mention was Loafing Down Long Island, which was one of my favorite books of the year. A biography I didn't mention was Break Shop, My First 21 Years by James Taylor, one of my favorite musical artists. So I've been thinking a lot about how to read more nonfiction, and here are my top 3 tips. 1, read your physical TBR. So nonfiction can be really complicated to get into. We might have all these aspirations to read about a certain subject. What I would say is if you want to read more nonfiction, read what you already have. So those could be biographies. Those could be memoirs. Those could be sustainability books. Those could be instructional books. Those could be cookbooks. Those could be things that you actually already have. I think getting started reading nonfiction is what is going to keep you reading nonfiction. Tip number 2. Read when the mood strikes. So whenever you're feeling like you're ready to read a nonfiction book, don't wait until you have the right nonfiction book. Just read what you've got when that mood is hitting you. So say you're like in between books and you're not sure what you're going to start, grab a nonfiction book. Even if you don't read the entire book, if it gets you rolling and gets you started reading, you're more likely to continue reading nonfiction. Now, the other side of tip number 2 is plan when you're going to read, but actually accomplish that plan. If you're reading for a video, if you're reading for a reading blog, if you're reading for a essay you want to write or a blog post you want to write, read that nonfiction. Either read when the mood strikes, grab a nonfiction book and read it whenever you feel like it, or schedule a event to read a nonfiction book. This will help you read more nonfiction. My third tip for reading more nonfiction is to find the nonfiction that works for you and start there. You might like memoirs, you might like biographies, you might like gardening books, you might like cookbooks, you might like something very, very simple. You might like short stories of true life accounts. You might like nature books, you might like travel logs. Any nonfiction that you want to read, start there. So find a nonfiction genre that you really like. If you really like travelogues, read some travelogues. Then move up to the historic books that you're interested in. Then move up to the books about political interest that you want to read. You don't have to start with a heavy book to read heavy and important nonfiction books, but you have to start somewhere. So those are my top 3 tips to read more nonfiction in 2021. I hope that you can use some of these tips in your reading, and I hope that if you do use them, you will leave a comment below. Thanks so much. Bye. Martin! I read how I'm surprised at how much nonfiction I read in 2020.